Welcome to the second of our videos about the early modern and modern era of Britain. Today we're going to look at the Tudor period. So as mentioned earlier in our introduction video, the great event that was the War of the Roses, that came to an end with Henry VII as the King of England. So the War of the Roses themselves, this conflict saw some 100,000 deaths, a large number for such a small kingdom. So Henry's victory came on August 22, 1485, when forces under his command killed the king at the time, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. So this event would be mythologized in Shakespeare's Richard III. The new king set up a new dynasty, the Tudors, which are named after Henry VII's ancestors. So the first Tudor king brought much needed stability back to England. He was a generally wise and far-sighted leader. Amongst other things, he supported England's important wool industry, while also getting the kingdom's finances under control. He reigned as king for almost 25 years, and eventually his son, Henry VIII, took his place when he died. So Henry VIII himself would have a profound effect on English history, and this is in no small part because of his dispute, his argument with Rome, and Rome was the great power center of Europe at the time. Henry's first marriage was to Catherine of Aragon. She was Spanish, but more importantly, she was also a Catholic. However, she never gave birth to a son, and she only gave birth to one daughter. Henry needed a son to continue his family rule, so Henry asked the Pope for a divorce or an annulment, but this was refused by the Pope. The main reason for this refusal was the greater power of Catholic Spain at the time, and the Pope needed to avoid offending the Spanish king. So the decision Henry made was a radical decision, and it was to remove the Catholic Church from England, removing all of its institutions, such as convents, and declaring a new Church of England with himself as the head of this new church. This was what is known as the Reformation, a change in the religious order in England. And with these new circumstances, he was able to annul his own marriage to Catherine, and he was able to search for a new wife. In reality, he would ultimately marry 6 women. Their names were Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. So eventually Henry VIII would have a male heir, later to be King Edward VI, and he was made king at the age of 9 when Henry VIII died. However, Edward only lived until the age of 15, and then he died and he had no heirs of his own. Now, because Edward was so young when he took power, the British government had anticipated this very situation. So the rules for succession, for taking power, had been developed. So according to the new plans put in place by Henry VIII, the decision as to who would assume the throne in the event of Edward's death would have to be made between 2 of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. So Mary was his daughter from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth was his daughter by Anne Boleyn. Eventually, Mary would succeed to the throne. Mary would go on to become known as Bloody Mary for her violent attempts to reverse the progress of the Reformation. She wished England to be Catholic again, and she only reigned for around 5 years. Actually, during this period, over 280 of her religious opponents were executed. In that period, they were killed. Unfortunately, Mary, like her father, encountered difficulty in producing an heir. She died in 1558. Her initial rival for the throne, Elizabeth, wound up succeeding her. So under Elizabeth's rule, the Reformation would continue in England. Elizabeth supported the Church of England against the Catholic Church. So going back to the separation of England from the Catholic Church, it is important to note that it would not have been possible without popular support of the people in England. The Catholic Church at the time was notoriously corrupt. It was very flashy with its wealth, very corrupt practices, and the distant rule from Rome irritated many people in England. However, in the early days after the separation, religious worship remains largely the same as it had been before. So the way the religious worship had changed began when a man called Thomas Cromwell took control of the church at Henry's appointment. So he removed many of the important leftover Catholic institutions of the new Church of England, chief amongst them the monasteries. So he removed the monasteries completely, and this was a very controversial move. The monasteries themselves provided for the welfare of the general population. This move also wiped out huge collections of priceless books, and so much so that Oxford University itself ended up without a library until 1602. So these developments in England were a greater part of the Protestant movement, which was a European Reformation against the Catholic Church. So this movement first began with a man called Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a renegade priest and an anti-corruption crusader living in what is now Germany. The Reformation is one of the most important developments in modern European history. It forced the spread of literacy, as worships were no longer forbidden from reading the Bible for themselves, which under Catholic worship they were not allowed to. It was read to them by their priests. So for the people of Tudor England, courtship and marriage represented a legal recognition of a person's growth from childhood to adulthood. It was an important rite of passage, and it took on various forms for people from different social backgrounds. So amongst England's upper classes, marriage was largely about preserving the high social standing of the given bride or the groom's family. Noble families would often sign contracts of marriage for their children well in advance, even before the child was mature. So families of this class also practiced something called a dowry, which involves the father of the bride giving valuable gifts, including money, to the other family. Middle-class families of this era had similar practices to the upper-class ones. However, middle-class marriage practices varied slightly depending on the actual wealth and property of the families involved. Dowries were practiced, but the value of the dowry gifts was usually much lower than the upper classes. The eldest son of a middle-class family would usually inherit his parents' property when they died. So things were very different for people from the lower classes in Tudor England. If you were from a poor family during this era, then you could get married at a later age, and you could have more control over who you married. However, this was the case because the poor obviously had fewer resources. So owing to the lack of inherited wealth in the lives of poor people, there was also less pressure from their parents when it came to choosing a spouse. So courtship itself simply refers to the stages in a romantic relationship in which a young couple become familiar with each other, and hopefully they develop feelings of love for one another. Courtship was not light-hearted. It was a very serious part of how society functioned. It usually proceeded in stages, and those stages would often involve giving gifts in front of witnesses. And it was not unheard of for a man to ask a third party, someone other than his love interest, to personally deliver a gift to the lady he wished to court. In this way, it was ensured that the courtship itself had witnesses from the start. I guess we can think of this as a kind of a starting period that would lead up to marriage. It was a whole process. It was not absolutely required that marriages of this period take place in a church. Couples could be legally married by declaring their consent to marry in front of public witnesses. Until 1556, the minimum age at which one could get married in England was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. After 1556, the age of consent was raised to 21. And this was raised in an effort to hold back the poverty caused by marriages amongst those people who could not yet support themselves.